let's jump right into this explainer. And I want you to start by picturing a truly cinematic wide shot. Imagine a billion-dollar rocket gleaming in the sun, violently piercing the sky as it heads out into the great unknown. Now, cut to a radically different scene right here on Earth. Families sleeping on the streets, children going to bed hungry, and everyday households completely bankrupted by medical debt. It's a profound, almost jarring paradox. And frankly, it frustrates millions of people around the globe. How can both of these realities exist at the exact same time?
It sets a dramatic, moody tone right off the bat, doesn't it? It begs this burning question that we've all probably asked ourselves at some point. Why do we chase distant worlds when our own world is bleeding? I mean, when you see a billion-dollar rover driving across alien soil while poverty persists in the richest nations on Earth, it feels deeply wrong. It feels like a massive failure of human empathy. But what we're going to uncover today is that the answer isn't cruelty, and it definitely isn't indifference.
It just creates this stark cognitive dissonance. On one side of the screen, we have the absolute pinnacle of human engineering and exploration. On the other, the dark reality of persistent human suffering. And it's incredibly easy to look at this side-by-side comparison and assume a direct cause and effect, right? We just assume that because we're funding the left side of this equation, we must be ignoring the right side. But the real reason for this gap is far more complex and honestly far more fascinating than a simple lack of compassion.
Section 1. The numbers don't lie. NASA versus Earth.
Okay, to solve this mystery, we need to step into detective mode and look at the actual numbers. Here's the figure that usually makes the headlines. NASA's annual budget is roughly $25 to $28 billion. On its own, that sounds absolutely enormous, like the kind of blockbuster budget that could solve all of our earthly problems overnight. But, as any good investigator knows, a single number without context can be incredibly misleading. We need to zoom in a bit closer.
Because here's the real plot twist. $75. That is the per capita cost. That means, on average, Americans spend just $75 per person, per year, on space exploration. When you break it down to the individual level like that, that towering $25 billion monolith suddenly shrinks down to a very modest annual subscription fee for the cosmos.
And if you want a real gasp moment, let's contrast that tiny $25 billion space budget against our other expenditures. U.S. federal welfare and poverty programs sit at about $1.2 trillion, and global military spending, a staggering $2.4 trillion annually. This fundamentally shatters the illusion that space is somehow draining our resources. The money is absolutely there for earthly problems. It's just living in entirely different, massive neighborhoods.
The reality is that space exploration makes up just half of 1% of the U.S. federal budget. To put that into perspective for you, Americans actually spend more money annually on pizza than they do on funding space exploration. Literally. So, if the space budget is barely a sliver of the overall pie, it forces us to ask, what is the real issue here? Why does poverty persist if space isn't the one stealing the funds?
Section 2. The real culprit. Systemic failure.
We have to shift our focus away from a supposed lack of resources and point the camera directly at systemic failure and political will. See, we fall for what psychologists call the false choice fallacy. Space budgets are highly visible. They're singular. It's one giant rocket with one clear purpose, producing a highly cinematic, heavily televised spectacle. Poverty, on the other hand, is diffuse, it's invisible, and it's deeply embedded in complicated systems like healthcare, wage stagnation, and tax structures. It is so much easier to point a finger at a visible rocket launch than it is to point a finger at a convoluted tax code.
To really grasp this, we need to understand this word orthogonal. It means operating on a completely different axis. The space program isn't anti-poverty, it's orthogonal to it. Think of it like an X and Y axis. Funding space doesn't move you backward on the poverty axis, they operate on totally independent tracks. In fact, as we're about to see, the space track actually creates immense indirect economic value that bleeds over into our daily lives.
This is what we call the growth paradox. By looking up, we're actually solving problems down below. Satellite technology has revolutionized global agriculture. Space assets give us our disaster response systems, our climate monitoring, our GPS, and our daily weather forecasting. These technologies have created massive economic value and indirectly lifted millions of people out of poverty through innovation and efficiency. Space investment doesn't subtract from Earth, it multiplies.
Section 3. Why choose space? The growth paradox.
If space operates on a different axis, why did governments aggressively fund the cosmos instead of solely pouring every last cent into fixing Earth? Well, the evolution of human ambition in space tells a fascinating story. In the 1960s, it was all about prestige and ideological power. The space race was basically a geopolitical chess match. Today, it's about that innovation spillover we just talked about, heavily driven by private sector competition. But if you look 200 years ahead, with climate change and resource depletion, developing off-world resources becomes existential infrastructure. It's about long-term survival. It's civilization hedging its bets.
So, the crucial point here is this innovation spillover multiplier. Every single dollar spent on space doesn't just vanish into the vacuum. It creates a massive economic multiplier effect right here on the ground. It creates high-paying jobs in engineering and manufacturing. It yields scientific breakthroughs that eventually scale down to everyday consumer products. It sparks whole new private industries. It's an absolute engine for technological supremacy and economic growth.
Section 4. The uncomfortable truth. Choosing poverty.
Now, we can't let society off the hook that easily. We've cleared space exploration of the charges, which means we now have to reveal the real villains in our systemic detective story. Let's totally shatter the illusion of this binary choice. If we took action tomorrow and redirected 100% of NASA's budget to poverty programs, the outcome would be that poverty still exists. Why? Because welfare budgets are separate, massive appropriations. NASA's $25 billion is just a drop in the bucket compared to that $1.2 trillion welfare budget. The only way to achieve true poverty reduction is to restructure systemic allocation to address the root causes.
So, if we actually have the resources, why does poverty persist? Well, the source data lays out this systematic indictment like a legal brief. Poverty persists because it often serves an economic function. Political systems sometimes fail by design to maintain a pool of cheap labor. Inequality is kept profitable through wage suppression. Wealth constantly concentrates at the very top through unequal, loophole-ridden tax policies. These are those invisible, deeply embedded systems we talked about earlier.
And if you want absolute proof that this is a matter of choice and not a lack of resources, consider this shocking number: $136 billion. That is the amount Americans choose to spend annually on pet food alone. Just let that sink in for a second. We spend vastly more on feeding our dogs and cats than we do on the entire NASA space budget. We are not being forced into choosing between space and poverty. We are actively making choices about where our wealth goes every single day.
Section 5. The real solution. Fund the future, fix the present. It's time for some moral resolution. If we've identified the real culprits, how do we actually fix it? Well, here is an empowering roadmap based on our sources. Step 1. Fix tax policy and close loopholes for the wealthy so they pay a proportional share. Step 2. Invest equally. Science, education, and healthcare are not competing goods. We can actually boost funding for all of them by reallocating our priorities. Step 3. Demand political accountability. Vote for representatives who prioritize systemic change over symbolic gestures. And Step 4. Understand complexity. We have to stop blaming highly visible single budget lines like NASA and start demanding real structural reform.
Which leaves us with this final, lingering challenge. The real question isn't about rockets or rovers. Honestly, it never was. The real question is this: do we actually want to build a society where poverty ends? We have the wealth. We have the technology. We absolutely don't have to choose between reaching for the stars and caring for our citizens. The systems that shape our world are ones we created, which means they're ones we can change. So, are you ready to stop blaming the cosmos and start restructuring the systems right here on Earth?